The reading is from Luke 24, starting at verse 13. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" Jesus asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe that all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us when he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and he has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. This is the word of the Lord.
Do you believe in miracles?
Yes.
Excellent. I was hoping the week after Easter and having sung those songs that the answer would be yes. I'm pleased to hear it. Some of us have been doing the 3-2-1 course. And on that course, Glenn Scrivener says the following: "A penniless preacher, Jesus, was slaughtered as a criminal, and since then he has been worshipped by billions. Jesus' movement is the largest, most diverse phenomenon the world has ever seen. It's been growing from the 1st century till now, and it has transformed the world unimaginably." That's extraordinary, isn't it? Jesus has turned crucifixion into world domination. That is some miracle. And the miracle continues today. God is still at work, and he calls us to be his witnesses to what he's done. In our passage today, the road to Emmaus, two ordinary people have their lives transformed when they meet the risen Jesus. Their lives are literally turned around and they become God's witnesses. Now, myself and Jackie, if we're not at a wild party on a Saturday evening, what we like can happen. If we're not doing that, then we like to watch a film. And for some reason, I'm the one who always has to choose the film that we watch. It's taken me 36 years to realise that I have to choose the film that Jackie likes. So I'm told that we prefer films that are based on real life. I'm sure I do like those films. We like films that have some humour in them, We also like films that have an element of suspense and mystery and some dramatic tension. And then finally, we like films that end with a message of hope. So we don't watch many French films, obviously. If the story of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus were made into a film, and it probably has been, it would tick all of those boxes. It's certainly a real-life story. These events really happened. Luke hasn't just made them up. Luke investigated the historical facts so that we can be sure, so that we can be certain that these happened. And there's definitely humour in the story, isn't there? The two disciples have left Jerusalem and they're heading back to Emmaus. Not surprisingly, they're talking about all that's happened over the last few days. And they're talking about Jesus. And then what happens? Jesus comes alongside them, the person they've just been speaking about. But they don't recognise him. As Jesus joins the two disciples, he asks them, "What are you talking about?" And Cleopas, the brave one, says, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have been happening?" That's great, isn't it? They must think we've got a right one here. He hasn't got a clue what's going on. Little do they know that he's the only one that knows what's really going on. I think Jesus joins in with the joke, doesn't he? He says, "Well, what things?" And they both say, "About Jesus of Nazareth." The disciples are about to tell Jesus, well, they're about to tell him about Jesus. There's definitely humour in this conversation, and I suspect it's one that these two disciples will never forget. There's humour, but there's also mystery, isn't there? Why is it that the disciples don't recognise Jesus as he walks alongside them? Now, you might not think that's so extraordinary, but I think it is. Last week, I walked to church, because Jackie had the car, so I walked to church, and 3 people failed to recognise me on the way, which is quite amazing, really, I thought. One of them I had known for over 30 years, didn't recognise me. One of them is in my home group. And I'm glad I've made such an impact on these people's lives. And yet they failed to recognise me. The reason they said they failed to recognise me was because I was wearing one of these. I've disappeared. Who is that guy at the front? There you go. I should take up a life of crime, shouldn't I, just by wearing a cap. I'll take it off so you know who I am. I'm guessing, but I suspect the reason the disciples didn't recognise Jesus wasn't because he was wearing a cap. I think there's probably a deeper meaning in why they didn't recognise him. Some commentators say that they were consumed with grief and sadness, and so they either had tears in their eyes or they spent the time looking down at the ground as they walked along. It's 7 miles from Jerusalem to Emmaus. I find that quite difficult to believe that they didn't look up or wipe the tears away from their eyes some point along that journey. Other commentators say that they didn't recognize Jesus because his appearance had changed after the resurrection. Now that does seem more likely to me, but we're explicitly told that the disciples were kept from recognizing him. This wasn't simply a case of mistaken identity. They were kept from recognizing Jesus for some reason. That's a bit strange, isn't it? Don't you think? This is Easter Sunday. It's an Easter Sunday afternoon. Jesus has risen from the dead. It's one of the most fantastic days in the history of the world. Now, if I were Jesus, and I'm very glad I'm not, but if I was Jesus, then I would want everyone to know that I'd risen from the dead. I'd want everyone to know that I was alive. I think I would be pretty clear in my thinking that what's the point in coming back from the dead if people don't recognise me? I got cross with 3 people not recognising me on the way to church. Surely Jesus wants to be recognised. And he wants to be recognised by these 2 disciples, doesn't he? They've left home and family and they're distraught at Jesus' death. Jesus could end their grief and sadness in a minute, in a moment, by just appearing, just walking up and letting himself be seen. Why do they have to walk all the way from Jerusalem to Emmaus, 7 miles, before Jesus reveals himself to him? It's a mystery, isn't it? I think there is a really good reason, but like all good films, I'm not going to spoil the ending. Whatever the reason, I think it's clear that these disciples weren't expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. They'd heard some strange stories from the women about the tomb being empty and then seeing angels, but, well, they dismissed that. They weren't quite clear what was going on. They dismissed the women, but they'd also dismissed what Jesus had told them when he was alive. He had told his disciples that he would die and rise again in 3 days. They didn't believe the women. More importantly, they didn't believe Jesus, did they? And I think this story shows that the appearance of Jesus wasn't an hallucination. People don't hallucinate for the people that they love and miss and then fail to recognize them. This isn't an hallucination. And it's also not the fact that Jesus revived in the tomb and just appeared to these people on the road to Emmaus. It would be impossible to be flogged, crucified, spend time in a tomb, roll away the tombstone, and then fail to be recognized. I'm not very observant, but I think I would recognize someone in need of urgent medical attention, as Jesus would have been. There's humour and there's mystery in this story, but there's pain and sorrow, isn't there? The disciples are walking away from Jerusalem, and they're grieving the death of their Lord Jesus. This is what they say next. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Luke seems to be highlighting on the very day that the heavens are celebrating, these 2 disciples are walking away with sadness and sorrow. Those words, we had hoped, I think expressed the pain and confusion that these 2 disciples were expressing. They had hoped that Jesus was the one who was going to redeem Israel, but their very own chief priests and rulers had handed him over to be crucified by the Romans. They'd put their hope in Jesus, but he'd died as a criminal on a cross. They might not say it out loud, but I think they must feel that Jesus has let them down, that God himself has let them down. They had hoped for so much, and they ended up with seemingly so little. When Jesus died, I think their hopes died with him. They had hoped. They've had enough. They're heading home. They're leaving Jerusalem. The other disciples might stay there. These 2 are not taking it anymore. They're going home. They want to leave everything behind them. It's at this point that Jesus joins the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Jesus comes alongside them. It's fantastic, isn't it? He shows compassion and love by drawing alongside these very 2 disciples. He enters into their grief and despair. Even if he doesn't let them recognize who he is alongside them. But his response is not the one we might expect. We might expect him to, comfort the disciples, surely. Everything's going to be okay. But he doesn't do that. He seems, amazingly to me, he seems to rebuke the 2 disciples. Jesus says, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? Now, I don't know how Jesus spoke those words. I suspect it was with compassion and grace. But there's nonetheless reproach there, isn't there? To us, the word foolishness might appear like a light-hearted word. It might be something we say to a silly child, stop being foolish. Or we might have this image in our mind of what a fool looks like. That is definitely not the image that came to the mind of the disciples when Jesus said, don't be foolish. The words that probably came to mind are Psalm 14, which starts off by saying, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. The fool in his heart says there is no God. Is that what the disciples were thinking? Had their hopes disappointed them so much, they thought, there can't even be a God. This is just such a disaster. Is that what they were thinking? This is a strong rebuke by Jesus. It doesn't mean that the person is being silly or stupid. To call someone a fool was a moral judgment, not an intellectual one. Jesus had previously told the disciples not to call anyone a fool, and for good reason. It's a moral judgment when you judge someone's heart. We can't do that, but Jesus can. Jesus sees these disciples' heart, and he calls them foolish. He says that they're slow to believe. I think Jesus is saying these disciples should have known better. They should have listened to Jesus, and they should have known the scriptures better. They've not taken the scriptures seriously enough. They've not taken what Jesus said seriously enough. They've not taken Jesus at his word. How foolish is that? If they had known the scriptures, they would have known that he had to die and rise again. And that's why Jesus takes them through that Old Testament study. He takes them through the scriptures. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explains to them that the Messiah had to first suffer and die and then rise from the dead. Now that must have been an amazing time. It would have been great to be in that Bible study with Jesus, going through the Old Testament. Some of the passages he must have spoken about. Maybe he spoke about the Passover lamb, how people were saved through the death of a Passover lamb. I'm sure he spoke about the Exodus, being led out of Egypt into freedom. He probably spoke about the Day of Atonement, about the priest putting his hands on the scapegoat and they being led out into the wilderness to take away the sins of the people. He would have spoken surely about King David and the temple, and the new Messiah is the new king and the new temple living with his people. And then he goes through all the prophets. Surely he spoke about Daniel and the coming of the Son of Man. Surely he spoke about Ezekiel and the valley of the dry bones. And surely he spoke about Isaiah and the suffering servant. The disciples should have known better. The whole of the Old Testament points to Jesus. If they had known their Bibles better, they would have known that the Messiah had to first suffer and die and then rise again. The disciples had called Jesus a prophet. That's a big mistake. Huge. Jesus is not just another prophet. All the prophets point to him. He is the fulfillment of everything that the prophets say. He is not just another prophet. He is something greater. The two disciples don't recognize Jesus on the road to Emmaus. To be honest, they didn't recognize Jesus before the resurrection and before the cross. As they approach Emmaus, it looks like Jesus is going to walk on further. I think for me, this is the turning point of the story. Will the disciples let Jesus carry on without knowing who he is? That would be a disaster, wouldn't it? Be a tragedy. If you'd walked with Jesus 7 miles and then he just goes on and you don't know who it is you've met. They've just spoken with some apparent stranger. That would be a disaster. But fortunately, they urge Jesus to stay with them. And Jesus responds. Jesus goes into their home and stays with them. And as he stays with them, it's then that he reveals himself to them. He reveals himself to them through the breaking of bread. Jesus takes the bread, he gives thanks, he breaks it, and he gives it to them. That's when they realize that this is Jesus. It's when he breaks the bread that they see that this is Jesus. Now, why is it at that particular point that Jesus reveals himself? Well, I think he's saying that the Messiah had to be broken. I think he's giving them a new understanding of what's just happened over the last 3 days. They thought they understood, but they didn't. On the cross, Jesus' body was broken. It was broken for them, and it was broken for us. The cross is not just a waste of life, but one of self-sacrifice. It's not the place of failure, but of victory. The cross is not the place where Israel's hopes are disappointed. It's where they're fulfilled. And the cross is the place where Jesus gives his life so that they and we might be saved. I think that's the reason why the disciples were kept from seeing Jesus on the road. If they had recognized Jesus right at the beginning when he walked up alongside them, all this would have been lost on them. They wouldn't have had that Bible study, and they wouldn't have had that breaking of the bread, because they would have been so excited by the resurrection. They would have been leaping around for joy, obviously. But they would have missed the purpose of the resurrection. They would have missed the purpose of the cross. It's Easter Sunday, but before these disciples can celebrate the resurrection, they've got to understand the cross. That's why Jesus hides himself initially. They're going to be God's witnesses. They better understand the cross as well as the resurrection. If Jesus had appeared straight away to them, they would have thought, excellent, Jesus is alive. Now he's going to kill the Romans. Now he's going to redeem Israel. No, that's not why he came. He came to die on a cross. He came to sacrifice himself for them and the Romans. In the preparation of this sermon, I did some intensive market research. So, I like to do my preparation thoroughly. So I asked 2 Christians that I know, what's the greatest miracle in the Bible? And they both said, it's not a very large sample, is it, 2? But they both said the resurrection. Now, I hate to contradict 2 fellow Christians, particularly as I'm married to one of them, but I'm going to do so. I don't think the resurrection is the greatest miracle in the Bible. I think the cross is the greatest miracle in the Bible. A miracle is something out of the ordinary, isn't it? Now, the resurrection to us is amazing. Jesus is the only person who's come back from the dead so far. But one day, each one of us is going to experience the resurrection. Not so extraordinary after all. The cross, Jesus died on the cross once and for all. He cried out, "It is finished," because it's never going to be repeated. When we see who Jesus is and what he accomplished on the cross is the greatest miracle in history. That's why Jesus gives the disciples a Bible study on why he had to suffer and then enter his glory. That's why Jesus reveals himself through the breaking of bread. That's why Jesus kept himself initially hidden from the disciples. There's a late twist. Like all good films, there's a twist at the end of the story. As soon as the disciples recognize Jesus, what happens? He disappears from sight. Once again, the disciples are unable to see Jesus. But does that mean they're thrown back into despair and hopelessness? Not a bit of it. They know that Jesus is alive, and they have a deeper understanding of the cross. He has died for them. Their grief has come to an end, and they now have a new hope and a new joy. Their lives have been literally turned around, isn't it? They were walking away from Jerusalem, now they run back to Jerusalem. They want to tell others about Jesus. Their lives have been transformed from people without any hope to God's witnesses. And again, like all good films, there's a sequel, isn't there? Luke 2, and we call it Acts, don't we? This is not the end of the story, this is the beginning of a new story. These witnesses are going to spread out the word of God to the ends of the earth. In Acts, Luke tells us how the gospel spreads from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. Well, in fact, it gets to Rome. Acts ends in Rome with Paul preaching the gospel in Rome. Of course it does. Jesus hadn't come to destroy the Romans. He'd come to save them. The disciples were wrong. And God's kingdom continues to grow today. It continues to go to the end of the earth. And he does it through us. We are God's witnesses. This isn't a 3-point sermon, this is a 3-prop sermon. So my last prop is that this book was given to me over 40 years. This very book, not very big, was given to me 40 years ago. I've finished reading it now, so. It's John's Gospel, and it was given to me by a friend at university who said, you might be interested in reading this. Interested? It changed my life. Through reading this Gospel, my eyes were opened to who Jesus was. I saw that Jesus died for me and that he rose from the dead, and I gave my life to him. I was thinking how simple it was for my friend just to say, you might find this interesting, you might want to read this. Just handed me a book. It was fairly simple. I'm sure they were praying in the background and they may have been nervous how I'd respond, but I took it and I read it and I gave my life to Christ. How easy was it from their perspective? It was a miracle by God, but from their perspective it was easy. And I think that's what God is calling us to do, just to share the good news with people we know. It might be just handing them a Bible tract or a gospel or some other piece of literature. It might be just telling them how we became a Christian. It might be inviting them to church. I don't think it's such a big deal, is it? These disciples rushed away to tell the other disciples what had happened. Jesus is asking us to do the same. That's how the miracle of God's kingdom is continuing to expand, just by people handing a gospel to someone or telling them about how God has changed their lives. It's fantastic, I think, and that's what God is calling us to do. Amen.